The shotgun blast shattered the storm-soaked night as Ruth Magnolia burst through the chapel doors, her wedding dress torn and bloodied, dragging behind her like a ghost shroud. Preacher Eli Joachim dropped his evening prayers and lunged forward. Just as she collapsed into his arms, her breath coming in ragged gasps that matched the thunder outside. "They killed him," she whispered against his chest, her fingers clutching his black coat with desperate strength. "They killed Cornelius right there at the altar, and now they're coming for me." Eli's weathered hands trembled as he lifted her face, seeing the purple bruises blooming across her porcelain skin like twisted flowers. In 37 years of shepherding souls in the village of Millhaven's Crossing, he'd never seen such raw terror in a woman's eyes. The rain hammered against the stained glass windows, each drop sounding like bullets, and somewhere in the darkness beyond, horses' hooves thundered closer. "Who did this to you, child?" His voice was steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Like a wildfire." "The Vance brothers," Ruth gasped, blood trickling from her split lip. "They said no Magnolia woman would marry outside their choosing. Said they owned our family's debts, owned me." Her laugh was bitter as broken glass. "Cornelius tried to protect me, drew his pistol right there in front of God and everyone, but Jedediah Vance was faster." Eli's jaw tightened. The Vance clan had poisoned this valley for generations, using fear and violence to bend others to their will. He'd seen their handiwork before burned-out farms terrorized families. Young men who'd crossed them found floating face down in the creek. But this was different. This was sacred ground they'd violated, innocent blood they'd spilled. "Can you walk?" he asked, already knowing the answer as her legs buckled beneath her. Without hesitation, he swept her into his arms, carrying her through the narrow corridor behind the pulpit to his private quarters. Ruth's head lolled against his shoulder, her auburn hair spilling like liquid copper across his arm. She was barely conscious now, shock and exhaustion taking their toll. But even in her weakness, he felt something stirring in his chest he'd thought long dead. "Stay with me," he murmured, kicking open the door to his simple bedroom. "You're safe now. I give you my word before God." As he laid her gently on his narrow bed, Ruth's eyes fluttered open, focusing on his face with startling clarity. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk everything for someone like me? I'm nothing but trouble wrapped in silk and shame." Eli knelt beside the bed, his calloused preacher's hand surprisingly gentle as he brushed the wet hair from her forehead. "Because," he said quietly, "sometimes God puts people in our path not to test our faith, but to awaken our hearts." Outside, the sound of approaching riders grew louder, their shouts cutting through the storm like blades. Ruth's eyes widened in panic, but Eli stood slowly, his hand moving to the loaded rifle he kept hidden behind his wardrobe. "Let them come," he said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made Ruth's breath catch. "This is hallowed ground, and I'll be damned if I let them desecrate it further." The riders circled the chapel like wolves, their torches hissing in the relentless rain. Eli counted at least 8 men through the window, their faces twisted with cruel anticipation. Jedediah Vance sat atop his black stallion, blood still speckling his fancy vest from the wedding massacre, his pale eyes scanning the chapel with predatory hunger. "Preacher," Jedediah's voice boomed across the churchyard, "we know you got our property in there. Send out the Magnolia girl, and we might let you keep breathing." Ruth stirred on the bed, trying to rise despite her injuries. "Don't let them." "Take me," she pleaded, her fingers catching Eli's sleeve. "Please, I'd rather die than become their plaything." Eli's hand covered hers, his touch surprisingly warm and steady. "That won't happen. Not while there's breath in my body." He moved to his desk, pulling out a leather-bound ledger and a pen. "Can you write your name?" "What?" Ruth's voice cracked with confusion. "Your name, can you write it?" His eyes were intense, purposeful, as he thrust the pen into her trembling fingers. Outside, Jedediah's patience was wearing thin. "You got 1 minute, holy man, then we're coming in." "I don't understand," Ruth whispered, but Eli was already writing. Frantically in the ledger, his handwriting bold and decisive. "Marriage records," he explained quickly. "In the eyes of God and the law, you'll be my wife, Ruth Joachim. They can't touch a preacher's wife without bringing the territorial marshal down on their heads." Ruth stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "You'd marry a woman you don't even know? Risk everything for a stranger?" Eli looked up from the ledger, his dark eyes holding depths she hadn't expected. "I know enough. I know you're brave enough to run through a storm to escape them. I know you loved Cornelius enough to marry him despite the danger. I know you'd rather die free than live in chains." He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And I know that for the first time in 20 years, I feel alive again." Before Ruth could respond, the chapel doors exploded inward. Jedediah Vance strode in like he owned the place, his boots echoing on the wooden floors, water streaming from his long coat. Behind him, his brothers spread out like a pack, their hands resting on their gun handles. "Evening, preacher," Jedediah drawled, his smile as cold as January frost. "Mighty fine storm we're having. Perfect night for collecting debts." Eli stepped into view, positioning himself between the intruders and his quarters. The marriage ledger was clutched in his left hand, his right hovering near his concealed pistol. "The chapel is closed for the evening, gentlemen. I suggest you return tomorrow for proper worship." Jedediah laughed, the sound echoing off the rafters like a death rattle. "Oh, we're here for something much more satisfying than prayer." His pale eyes glittered with malice. "See, there was a wedding tonight that got interrupted. The bride seems to have gone missing, and we aim to find her. The only woman under this roof," Eli said carefully, "is my wife." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Jedediah's smile faltered, replaced by something much darker. "Your wife?" He spat tobacco juice onto the chapel floor. "Preacher, you've been living alone in this godforsaken place so long. You're starting to see things." L.A. held up the marriage ledger, his signature still wet with ink. "Ruth Magnolia became Ruth Joachim 30 minutes ago, witnessed by God Almighty himself. You boys are trespassing on holy ground, threatening a man of the cloth and his lawfully wedded wife." The silence stretched tight as a hangman's noose. Then Jedediah's hand moved toward his gun, and Ruth appeared in the doorway behind Eli, wrapped in his spare coat, her chin raised defiantly despite the fear in her eyes. "Hello, Jedediah," she said quietly. "Come to add murdering a preacher to your sins?" Jedediah's hand froze halfway to his pistol as his eyes locked on Ruth, even disheveled and bruised. She was breathtaking, and Eli felt a surge of possessive protectiveness he'd never experienced before. The way the outlaw looked at her like she was property to be claimed made his blood boil. "Ruth, darling," Jedediah's voice dripped false sweetness, "you're making this much harder than it needs to be. Your daddy's debts don't disappear just because you play dress up with the preacher here." "My father's debts died with him," Ruth replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And any claims you had on the Magnolia name died with Cornelius tonight." One of Jedediah's brothers, a scarred brute named Cain, stepped forward with his gun drawn. "Enough talking. We came here for the girl and we're leaving with her." That's when Eli moved. 20 years of wielding an axe to split firewood and hauling water from the well had given the preacher surprising speed and strength. His fist connected with Cain's jaw with a crack that echoed through the chapel, sending the man stumbling backward into a pew. The gun clattered across the floor as Cain hit the ground, blood streaming from his mouth. "This is consecrated ground," Eli growled, his peaceful demeanor replaced by something far more dangerous. And she's under my protection now. Jedediah's remaining brothers spread out, but the narrow chapel worked against them. Eli had spent decades learning every board, every shadow in this place. When Tobias Vance tried to flank him from the left, the preacher grabbed a heavy brass candlestick and brought it down on the man's wrist, shattering bone with surgical precision. "You're making a mistake, holy man," Jedediah snarled, finally drawing his own weapon. "The Magnolia family owes us $1,500. The girl comes with us, or we burn this place down with both of you in it." "The debt was her father's, not hers," Eli replied, never taking his eyes off the gun barrel pointed at his chest. "And even if it was, no amount of money gives you the right to buy and sell human souls." Ruth stepped closer to Eli, her shoulder, brushing his arm. "Let them burn it," she said quietly. "Let them burn everything. I won't go back to being their prisoner." The conviction in her voice stirred something deep in Eli's chest. Here was a woman who'd choose death over slavery, who'd stand beside him even when facing certain destruction. In that moment, he realized his hasty marriage proposal had been about more than just protection. It had been about claiming something precious before it could be destroyed. "There's another way," he said suddenly, his mind racing. "The territorial gambling laws. I challenge your claim." Jedediah's eyebrows rose. "What the hell are you talking about, preacher? Your family's been winning debts through rigged poker games for years. Everyone knows it, but no one's been willing to challenge you." Eli's voice grew stronger. "I'm calling for a territorial judge to review Magnolia's debt. If the games were crooked, the debt's invalid. And what if they weren't?" Jedediah's smile returned, cruel and confident. Eli felt Ruth's hand slip into his, her fingers intertwining with his. "Then I'll work to pay it off myself. Every cent with honest labor." $1,500 would take you 20 years, Jedediah laughed. "Then I'll work for 20 years. Eli's grip tightened on Ruth's hand, "but she stays free. She stays my wife. And if any harm comes to her while I'm working off this debt, I'll hunt down every last Vance and send them to meet their maker." The threat, delivered in the preacher's calm, measured tone, carried more weight than any shouted curse. Jedediah studied him for a long moment, seeming to recognize that this mild-mannered man of God had steel in his spine that wouldn't bend. "You got yourself a deal, preacher," he said finally. "But the girl stays in Millhaven's Crossing where we can keep an eye on her, and if you try to run—" "We won't run," Ruth said firmly, squeezing Eli's hand. "This is our home now." 3 months had passed since that storm-soaked night, and autumn painted Millhaven's Crossing in shades of gold and crimson. Ruth stood in the chapel's small garden, her hands deep in the earth as she tended to the winter vegetables she'd planted. The bruises had long since faded, but the memories remained sharp as broken glass. Eli emerged from the chapel carrying 2 cups of coffee, his shirt sleeves rolled up from morning preparations for Sunday service. The sight of him still made her heart stutter, not from fear, as it once had with other men, but from something warmer and infinitely more dangerous. "The Hendersons sent word they'll be bringing their new baby for baptism next week," he said, settling beside her on the wooden bench he'd built beneath the old oak tree. "That's wonderful." Ruth accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. Mrs. Henderson seemed so worried during her pregnancy. She had cause to be, considering what happened to their first. Eli's expression darkened. "The Vances have taken too much from this community. Too many young men dead, too many families broken." Ruth studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. "You've been meeting with the other men again." It wasn't a question. She'd seen them gathering after evening services, farmers and shopkeepers who'd lost sons or brothers to Vance violence. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces grim with purpose. "The territorial marshal finally responded to our letters, Eli," sighed quietly. He's sending an investigator next month to look into the gambling allegations. And if he finds what we know he'll find, then the debts are cleared and the Vances lose their stranglehold on this valley. Eli turned to face her, his dark eyes intense. But Ruth, you need to know if this goes wrong, if they decide we're too much trouble, ... She silenced him by placing her fingers against his lips. We've had this conversation before. I'm not leaving. I'm not hiding. This is my home now, with you. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Their marriage had begun as a desperate protection, but somewhere between shared morning coffee and evening prayers, it had become something neither of them had expected. They slept in separate rooms, maintained proper appearances, but the tension between them grew stronger each day. Ruth, Eli began, his voice rough with emotion, but she was already moving away, busying herself with deadheading the last of the summer flowers. The Hendersons aren't the only ones with news, she said, deliberately, changing the subject. I got a letter from my cousin Ophelia in Sacramento. She's offering me a position as a teacher in her school. Eli went very still. And what did you tell her? I haven't responded yet. Ruth's hand stilled on the flowers. It would be safer for you if I left. The Vances would have no reason to target you once I'm gone. Is that what you want? To leave? The question was quietly spoken, but Ruth heard the pain beneath it. She turned to face him, seeing the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. This strong, gentle man who'd risked everything to save her was afraid of losing her, afraid of wanting her too much. What I want, she said carefully, is to know that our marriage means something beyond a signature and a ledger. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Eli rose slowly, moving to stand before her. His hands, those gentle preacher's hands that could deliver both salvation and violence, cupped her face with infinite tenderness. Ruth, he whispered, what I feel for you goes far beyond duty or protection. Somewhere between that first night and this moment, I fell in love with my own wife. Her breath caught, and she leaned into his touch. I thought I was imagining it. The way you look at me sometimes, the way you say my name ... like it's a prayer, he finished. Because it is. You've become my prayer, my hope, my... Ruth silenced him with a kiss, pouring 3 months of suppressed longing into the contact. Eli groaned against her mouth, his arms coming around her waist to pull her closer. They were lost in each other when the sound of approaching horses shattered their moment. Jedediah Vance sat atop his stallion at the garden gate, his pale eyes glittering with malicious amusement. Well, he drawled. Looks like the preacher and his bride are finally getting acquainted. Ellie moved protectively in front of Ruth, but she stepped beside him, their fingers intertwining naturally. What do you want, Jedediah? Just checking on my investment, he replied with a cold smile. Making sure you're both still here, still committed to our arrangement. We gave you our word, Eli said evenly. Words are cheap, preacher. Actions matter more. Jedediah's gaze flickered between them. I hear there's been some letter writing lately, some folks reaching out to territorial authorities. Ruth felt Eli tense beside her, but his voice remained calm. People have a right to seek justice. Justice? Jedediah laughed. Boy, you have no idea what justice looks like in these parts, but you're about to learn. The federal investigator arrived on a Tuesday morning that dawned crisp and clear. Marshal Deputy Thomas Whitmore was a lean, weathered man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He rode alone, which surprised everyone in Millhaven's Crossing. Most lawmen traveled in groups when venturing into Vance territory. Ruth watched from the chapel steps as Eli greeted the marshal, their voices carrying on the autumn air. Behind her, The church ladies were preparing for the afternoon quilting circle, but their usual chatter was subdued. Everyone knew what this visit meant: freedom or further bondage for them all. "Mrs. Joachim?" Deputy Whitmore approached with his hat in his hands, his manner respectful. "I understand you were present at some of the business transactions in question?" "I witnessed my father's final poker game with the Vances," Ruth replied carefully. "The night before he died. And what did you observe?" Ruth glanced at Eli, who nodded encouragingly. "Jedediah dealt from the bottom of the deck at least 3 times. My father was drunk, they kept pouring him whiskey, and by the end, he could barely see his cards." The marshal made notes in a small leather book. "Were there other witnesses?" "Cornelius. Bramblewood saw it too." Ruth's voice caught on her late fiance's name. "But he's gone now." "Yes, I heard about the wedding incident." Whitmore's expression darkened. "That's another matter I'll be investigating. Murder is a federal crime when it involves territorial citizens." Hope bloomed in Ruth's chest, but Eli placed a cautioning hand on her shoulder. They'd learn not to trust too quickly in the promise of justice. "I'll need to examine any documents related to the debts," Whitmore continued. "Promissory notes, gambling records, anything you might have." "The Vances keep all records at their compound," Eli said. "They're not likely to cooperate with your investigation." Whitmore smiled grimly. "I have federal warrants, Reverend. They'll cooperate or face charges of obstruction." As if summoned by their conversation, the thunder of hooves announced the arrival of the Vance brothers. But this time, they weren't alone. At least 20 riders followed them, faces hard with menace. The townspeople who'd been going about their daily business suddenly found urgent errands that took them indoors. Jedediah dismounted slowly, his pale eyes fixed on the federal marshal. "Well now, what do we have here?" "A genuine lawman come to visit our little valley. Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas Whitmore," the investigator introduced himself, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "I'm here investigating allegations of fraud and intimidation." "Fraud?" Jedediah's laugh was sharp as winter wind. "That's a harsh word for honest gambling, Marshal. These mountain folk just don't like losing." "Then you won't mind showing me your records," Whitmore replied smoothly. "All games involving deceased parties, specifically one Jonas Magnolia." Ruth saw the flash of calculation in Jedediah's eyes. Behind him, his brothers shifted restlessly, hands drifting toward their weapons. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a blade. "I'm afraid our records were destroyed in a recent fire," Jedediah said with mock regret. "Terrible accident, lost years of careful bookkeeping." "How convenient," Whitmore observed. "When did this fire occur?" "Oh, just last week. Tragic, really." The marshal made another note. "I'll want to examine the burned remains. Sometimes papers survive partial fires, especially if they were kept in metal containers." Jedediah's facade slipped, revealing the cold fury beneath. "Marshal, you seem like a reasonable man. Perhaps we could discuss this over drinks, away from present company." His gaze flicked meaningfully toward Ruth and Eli. "I'm quite comfortable discussing federal crimes in public," Whitmore replied. "In fact, I'd prefer witnesses." That's when everything went wrong. Cain Vance, still bearing scars from his encounter with Eli's fist, made his move. His gun cleared leather with practiced speed, aimed directly at the marshal's back. But Eli was faster. The preacher's warning shout coincided with his shoulder hitting Whitmore, sending both men tumbling off the chapel steps. Cain's shot went wide, shattering a stained glass window that had graced the church for 30 years. In the chaos that followed, Ruth found herself pressed against the chapel wall, Eli's body shielding her as gunfire erupted across the churchyard. The Vance riders had drawn their weapons, but the townspeople weren't as defenseless as they'd appeared. Rifle barrels emerged from windows, and the blacksmith stepped into the street with a shotgun that had seen service in the war. "Federal officer under attack," Whitmore shouted, his own gun now in hand. "All citizens are deputized." The words galvanized the town. Men who'd lived in fear for years suddenly found their courage, united behind a badge that represented real authority. The Vances found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered, their reign of terror finally facing organized resistance, but Jedediah wasn't finished. As his men retreated under withering fire, he grabbed Ruth, yanking her away from Eli with one arm while pressing his gun to her temple with the other. "Stand down," he roared. "All of you, or the preacher's wife dies." The shooting stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of gunpowder smoke drifting on the wind and Ruth's ragged breathing against the steel of Jedediah's gun barrel. The standoff stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Jedediah's arm was iron around Ruth's waist, his gun pressed so tightly against her temple that she could feel the cold metal bruising her skin. Eli stood frozen 10 feet away, his hands raised but his eyes blazing with barely controlled fury. "Let her go, Vance," Marshal Whitmore commanded, his weapon trained on Jedediah's head. "You're already looking at federal charges. Don't add kidnapping to the list. Shut up." Jedediah snarled, his composure finally cracking. "This whole valley belongs to my family. We built it, we run it, and we decide who lives and dies." His grip tightened on Ruth, making her gasp. Starting with this little problem. Ruth felt the pressure of the gun increase, but instead of fear, a strange calm settled over her. She'd faced death before on her wedding night, in the storm, in the months of uncertainty that followed. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't facing it alone. "Jedediah," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. "Do you remember what you told me the night you killed Cornelius?" The outlaw's eyes narrowed. "What are you babbling about, girl?" "You said no Magnolia woman would marry outside your choosing." Ruth's voice grew stronger, more confident. "But I'm not a Magnolia anymore, am I? I'm Ruth Joachim now. I chose my own path, chose my own man, and there's not a damn thing you can do to change that." "Ruth," Eli warned, recognizing the defiant tilt of her chin, but she wasn't finished. "You want to know what real power looks like, Jedediah? It's not fear or violence or stolen money." She twisted slightly in his grip, meeting his pale eyes with steady resolve. "Real power is choosing love over fear. It's standing with someone, even when it might cost you everything." "Shut up." Jedediah's hand trembled with rage. "You've already lost," Ruth continued relentlessly. "The federal marshal has all the evidence he needs. The town is united against you. Your reign of terror is over." She smiled, the expression sharp as a blade. "And the saddest part? You'll die alone, unloved, unmourned, while I'll live surrounded by people who chose to stand with me." Jedediah's control finally snapped. "Then die with your precious." But Ruth had been counting on his anger, using his fury to mask her subtle shifting. As his gun hand moved, she threw herself forward and down, breaking his grip and rolling away. Eli moved in the same instant, launching himself at Jedediah with the fury of a man protecting everything he held sacred. The two men crashed to the ground in a tangle of fists and fury. Jedediah was younger, meaner, but Eli fought with the desperate strength of love itself. They rolled across the dusty churchyard, each seeking the advantage, while the guns skittered away across the stones. Marshal Whitmore couldn't get a clear shot without risking Eli, and the other Vance brothers were pinned down by rifle fire from the surrounding buildings. It came down to this two men fighting for the soul of Millhaven's Crossing. Eli's fist connected with Jedediah's jaw, snapping the outlaw's head back. Blood streamed from both their faces, but neither man yielded. They grappled for position. Jedediah's knife appearing as if by magic, its blade seeking Eli's ribs. "No!" Ruth screamed, snatching up a fallen piece of broken window frame. Without hesitation, she brought the jagged glass down on Jedediah's wrist, opening a crimson gash that made him drop the blade. Jedediah roared in pain and fury, backhanding Ruth with enough force to send her sprawling. But the momentary distraction was all Eli needed. His hands closed around Jedediah's throat, and 20 years of suppressed anger at injustice, violence, and cruelty poured into that grip. "She's mine." Eli growled, his voice barely human. "She chose me, and I choose her, and nothing you do will ever change that." Jedediah clawed at Eli's hands, his face turning purple, but the preacher's grip was inexorable. Only Ruth's voice, calling his name with desperate love, pulled him back from the edge of murder. "Eli, stop. He's finished. We won." Slowly, reluctantly, Eli released his grip. Jedediah collapsed, gasping and broken, while Marshal Whitmore moved in with shackles. Around the churchyard, the remaining Vance brothers were surrendering, their will to fight broken with their leader's defeat. Ruth knelt beside Eli, her hands gentle on his bruised face. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." But even as she said the words, she knew the real beginning was just starting. They'd fought for their right to choose each other, and now they had to learn how to live with that choice. 6 months later, spring had transformed Millhaven's crossing into something Ruth barely recognized. Gardens bloomed where once only fear had grown, children played in streets that had known only hushed whispers, and the church bell rang out joyfully each Sunday morning, calling a community finally free to worship without looking over there. Shoulders. Ruth stood in their bedroom, their shared bedroom now, propriety having given way to honesty after that day in the churchyard, brushing her hair before the mirror Eli had surprised her with for her birthday. Through the window, she could see him in the garden, shirt sleeves rolled up as he worked the soil where they'd plant this year's vegetables. The federal investigation had cleared, all debts obtained through fraud, which meant virtually everything. The Vances had claimed Jedediah and his brothers were serving lengthy prison sentences, and their confiscated property was being redistributed to the families they terrorized. The transformation had been remarkable, like watching a community exhale after holding its breath for decades. "Mrs. Joachim?" A soft voice called from the chapel entrance. Ruth smiled, recognizing young Mercy Henderson, barely 16 and glowing, with the news she'd come to share. "In here, dear," Ruth called, setting down her brush. Mercy appeared in the doorway, practically vibrating with excitement. "Ruth, I had to tell you first Thomas proposed. We're getting married in the fall." Ruth embraced the girl warmly, remembering her own interrupted wedding and grateful that Mercy would have the celebration that had been stolen from her. "Have you told your parents?" "They're over the moon. Mama's already planning the dress." Mercy's expression grew more serious. "Ruth, would you stand with me as my matron of honor?" The title still felt strange on Ruth's tongue. Matron, wife, these were roles she'd grown into gradually, like a flower opening to sunlight. Her marriage to Eli had deepened beyond mere protection or convenience into something profound and sustaining. "I'd be honored," Ruth replied, meaning every word. After Mercy left, bubbling with wedding plans, Ruth walked out to join Eli in the garden. He looked up at her approach, soil on his hands and satisfaction in his dark eyes. "Let me guess," he said, grinning. "Another wedding to plan?" Mercy Henderson and Thomas Wright. They want a fall ceremony. Ruth knelt beside him, not caring about dirt on her dress. "I told her yes." "Good." Eli's expression grew thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it? How quickly things can change when people stop living in fear." Ruth nodded, thinking of all the changes that had swept through their lives. The community had not only survived, but thrived. New families were moving to the valley, drawn by stories of good land and honest law. The school had reopened with Ruth as its first official teacher, and their own relationship had blossomed from desperate necessity into deep, abiding love. "Eli," Ruth said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." He must have heard something in her tone because he set down his tools and gave her his full attention. "What is it?" Ruth took his hands in hers, soil and all, meeting his eyes with joy and nervous excitement. "I'm carrying your child." The words hung in the spring air between them, precious and fragile as new life itself. Eli's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, wonder, joy, and finally a love so profound it took Ruth's breath away. "A baby?" he whispered, his hands trembling in hers. "Due in late autumn, if I've calculated correctly." Ruth's voice caught with emotion. "I know we never discussed. We never planned." Ellie silenced her with a kiss that tasted of hope, and promises and futures they dared not imagine. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. "Ruth Joachim," he said solemnly, "you came into my life in a storm, and you've been my sunshine ever since. This child, our child, will be born into a world we helped make safer, into a love we chose and fought for and earned." Ruth laughed through her tears, thinking of that terrified girl in a torn wedding dress who'd stumbled into this chapel seeking nothing more than shelter from the rain. That girl could never have imagined this contentment, purpose, love that grew stronger with each passing day. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Taking me in that night? Everything that came after?" Eli's answer was immediate and certain. "Never, not for a single moment." He placed his hand gently over her still flat stomach. "That night, I thought I was saving you. I didn't realize you were saving me right back." As the sun set over Millhaven's crossing, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Ruth and Eli sat together on their garden bench, planning for the future and marveling at the journey that had brought them here. The chapel bell tolled the evening hour, its voice carrying across a valley finally at peace, while somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang of love and hope and new beginnings. Ruth had come to Eli's chapel seeking shelter from a storm, and he had given her that and so much more. He'd given her his name, his protection, his heart, and now the promise of a future neither had dared dream possible. Preacher. Eli had indeed taken Ruth in from the rain and given her his name, but in return, she had given him a reason to believe in miracles again, a love worth fighting for, and a happiness that would last all their days.